Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be with you. I've just heard about Georg Forster, and I think it's a great honor to be following him too. Sounds like a wonderful guy. So, human is an ancient word, but the concept of humanity is modern. No one knows exactly where the old word comes from. Giambattista Vico, in his New Science of 1725, thought that its source lay in the Latin word for burying, that is humando, itself derived from humus, meaning soil. Humans, then, would above all be people of the soil who bury their dead. They come from the earth and will ever return to it. Enlightenment thinkers, however, were eventually to upend this logic, appealing instead to universal powers of reason or intellect destined to emancipate humankind from earthly bondage and cut all ties to the ground, to place, and to nature. The modern concept of humanity has its source in this inversion, in the establishment of a condition, namely the human condition, over and above the state of nature that holds all other creatures in its grip. And nature, by the same token, was no longer seen to be enriched and fortified by the labors of generations past. It was treated rather as a platform for human endeavors and a depository for a history whose energy is now spent, leaving its residues buried beneath the surface. And so the ground, now understood as a passive substrate, rather than as an active and energizing force in the ongoing generation of life, could be excavated with impunity. Digging up the past, once associated with the dark arts of necromancy, became a respectable antiquarian profession. So with that, archaeology was born, along with the idea of the human career as an ascent from rude nature through shades of savagery and barbarism to the perfection of the human condition in refined civility. Now, of this career, only the later phases, initiated by the onset of written records, were considered truly historic. Everything prior to this watershed was considered preparatory for civilization, much as childhood was considered preparatory for adult life. So real history is for grown-ups. But the very idea of a preparation for history, or what came to be known as prehistory, was thus a direct precipitate of Enlightenment humanism. And yet many scholars now proclaim the days of humanism to be over, or at least numbered. We are entering, they say, into a new era of post-humanity. So what will become then of the idea of prehistory? And in my lecture today, I shall hazard an answer. I shall begin, however, with a word about origins. Because if there's one question that has exercised the minds of prehistorians, perhaps more than any other, it is this: when and where did prehistory begin? In his inquiries into the origin of species, Charles Darwin had shown that living kinds emerge not through any singular act of creation, but through a gradual process of modification and diversification strung out along lines of descent. And although in his book On the Origin of Species he had rather little to say about human beings, the assumption was that humankind had evolved in the same way, through a diversification within the genus Homo, of which our own species, namely sapiens, was the only extant lineage. Now, as a man of his time, of liberal disposition, Darwin was as convinced as anyone of the founding opposition between reason and nature that defined the Enlightenment project. Where he differed, however, was in applying this opposition across the board, finding the rudiments of intellect even in the humblest of organisms, such as the lowly earthworm, as well as a powerful residue of instinct in even the most rational of humans. So that's why he could claim that the difference between humans and animals lower in the scale, although vast, was still of degree rather than kind. But if there was no threshold to cross, if the story of human evolution was one of countless minute gradations, then was there any point of origin at all? Now, in his later work, entitled The Descent of Man, he concluded that there was not. His famous and highly controversial conclusion was rather that the mechanism of natural selection, relentlessly driving up heritable powers of intelligence, had continued to operate as it had ever done, eventually raising civilized men above primitive savages in precisely the same way that savages were raised over apes. Now, while Darwin himself was no racist, this conclusion provided an open door of scientific legitimacy for often genocidal adventures of colonization launched at the time by white Europeans on native populations around the world. As late as the 1930s, established physical anthropologists were defending a color-coded vision of humankind, divided into races on a scale from white to black, with intermediate shades of yellow and red, locked in a xenophobic struggle in which the lighter shades would inevitably rise to the top. Though it took the second war in a century to break out among the supposedly civilized races of Europe, itself fueled by xenophobia, for such ideas to be finally refuted. In the wake of the Holocaust, what was self-evident to Darwin and most of his contemporaries, namely that human populations differed in their heritable intellectual capacities on a scale from primitive to civilized, that was no longer acceptable. So Darwin's view that the difference between the savage and the civilized man was one of brain power gave way in mainstream science to a strong moral and ethical commitment to the idea that all humans, past, present, and future, are equally endowed, at least so far as their moral and intellectual capacities are concerned. All human beings, as Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, are endowed with reason and conscience. Now, this was in effect to revert to a humanism of pre-Darwinian vintage, already propounded by Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. The argument goes that if human beings are one in their possession of reason and conscience, in other words, if they are the kinds of beings who, according to orthodox juridical precepts, can exercise rights and responsibilities, then they must differ in kind and not degree from all other beings that lack such endowment. And as if to emphasize this unity, post-war scientists reclassified extant human beings as members not just of the same species, but of the same subspecies, now designated Homo sapiens sapiens. But this was no ordinary species. Doubly sapient, the first attribution of wisdom, the outcome of a process of encephalization, marked it out within the world of living things, had a big brain. But the second, far from marking a further subdivision, registered a decisive break from that world. And in what many late 20th century prehistorians took to calling the human revolution, the earliest representatives of this new subspecies were alleged to have achieved a breakthrough without parallel in the history of life, setting them on a path of ever-increasing discovery and self-knowledge, otherwise known as culture. Human beings by nature, it was in the historical endeavor of reaching beyond that very nature that they progressively realized the condition of being human, in which the essence of their humanity was seen to reside. Half in nature, half out, they were condemned to a split-level existence, torn between the contrary imperatives of intelligence and instinct, or reason and emotion. And it was precisely in the excess of one over the other, in their developing capacity to remove themselves from nature, that humans, or at least the most civilized among them, were credited with the ability to imagine themselves as creatures of nature. So the double-barreled, subspecific appellation of Homo sapiens sapiens perfectly epitomizes the hybrid constitution of these revolutionary creatures. Popularly known as anatomically modern humans, that is, by contrast to the archaic variety, the so-called Neanderthals, who supposedly never made it through to the second grade of sapientization, their prototypical representatives are portrayed as archetypal hunter-gatherers, people for whom history has yet to begin. Biologically, just like us, they are supposed to have remained culturally at the starting block, fated to enact a script perfected through millennia of adaptation under natural selection. At the other end of history stand the arch representatives of high modernity, namely scientists, in whom an absolute commitment to reason has finally put paid to the promptings of innate desire. Seeing their own reason reflected in the mirror of nature, they alone pretend to read the script that natural selection has written for their hunter-gatherer antecedents. So between the hunter-gatherer and the scientist, respectively pre- and post-historic, is supposed to lie all the difference between being and knowing, between the adaptive surrender to nature and its subjugation in the light of reason. And yet, paradoxically, despite having refuted after Darwin the very idea that for any species there exists an essence of its kind, the one thing that science is incapable of relinquishing is its essentialist view of humanity. And this is for the simple reason that the project of science depends on it. Indeed, it's the very appeal to nature transcending humanity that provides science with the platform of supremacy from which, with no little hubris and profound contradiction, it asserts that human beings are part and parcel of the natural world. So on which side should we place the human? Does the word refer to the human being or to being human, to species or to condition? Or does the significance of the word, at least as it is situated in the discourses of modernity, lie precisely in its duplicity, in the fact that we cannot name the species or the subspecies without calling up the condition, and vice versa? Perhaps the idea of the human in its modernist inflection points to nothing so much as the anxiety, amounting to an existential dilemma, of a creature that can know itself and the world of which it is a part only by taking itself out of that world and viewing it, as it were, from the far side. And it's a dilemma seemingly recapitulated in the life of every human being as it progresses from infancy through childhood to full maturity. Does not the infant start life no differently from any animal as a creature of nature? Born of man and woman, it is surely a human being, yet initially having no awareness of itself as existing in a world, or indeed of the world in which it exists, it still appears to fall some way short of being human. So are some humans more human than others? Are we to think of the child as an intermediate being, halfway between nature and culture, exiting one in preparation to the other? Writing only a quarter of a century ago, the anthropologist Walter Goldschmidt could still assert, as though it was self-evident, that childhood is characterized by, and I quote, the process of transformation of the infant from a purely biological being into a culture-bearing one. On the way from infancy to adulthood, children are made to appear biologically complete, but culturally half-baked. And the same goes for prehistoric hunter-gatherers, likewise suspended in a liminal phase in the transition from a natural to a fully cultural life. If grown-ups are more human than children, then by the same token, scientists are more human than hunter-gatherers. And whether for the individual human being or for humankind as a whole, it is at the intersection of the axis of biological descent with the growth of civility at the moment where culture takes off from its baseline in hereditary endowment that the point of origin is generated. Even today, it is common to speak of early man, rather more often than early woman, and of the child's early years, as though the antiquity of prehistoric hunter-gatherers could be judged, like the ages of preschool children, by their proximity to their respective origins. Just as the child was deemed to be closer to its origin than the adult, so likewise early humans were thought to be closer than later ones to that mighty moment when humanity began. Yet, if human prehistory has a point of origin, what could it mean to have been living close to that point, or even at the crucial moment of transition itself? How can one conceivably distinguish those actions and events that carried forward the movement of prehistory from those that set it in motion in the first place? In fact, it's not hard to see in the image of our hunter-gatherer ancestors looking out upon the dawn of civilization the reflection of a decidedly modernist rhetoric. One can almost imagine a television presenter lurking in the background. Our epic story, recites the voiceover, is about to begin. Yet, despite a frantic and much publicized search for the moment of emergence of anatomically modern humans, prehistorians have failed to find it. And this is for the simple reason that there was no such moment. It's a fabrication of Enlightenment humanism. So what is to be done? Few would doubt today that humans have evolved, or that this evolution is rather recent in the wider scheme of things. Nor can we doubt that human beings are both the shapers of their own history and in turn shaped by it. So how can we close the gap between history and evolution without, as Darwin did, reducing the former to the latter? Is it even possible to restore humans to the continuum of organic life without thereby draining this life of its historical impulse? Well, the post-war reaffirmation of universal humanity took us back, as we've seen, to a pre-Darwinian Enlightenment. Now, however, that the project of the Enlightenment is itself foundering, it's perhaps timely to look even further into the past, to the thinking of pre-modern times. It's not as though our self-description as humans was an invention of the 18th century, as some contemporary scholars seem to believe. For no less than 4 centuries before Vico was wondering about the etymology of human, the question of how to pin down the meaning of this most enigmatic of words was already troubling another thinker of great insight, Ramon Llull. Born and raised on the island of Mallorca, Llull enjoyed a long and productive life, during which he wrote a staggering 280 books composed in Latin, Arabic, and his native Catalan. And one of the last of these was the Logica Nova, written in Genoa in 1303, in his 71st year. Now, in Lull's cosmology, everything is a doing, a happening, a going on. Fire, for example, is not a thing that burns, it is burning. And the human, by the same token, is humaning. And to express this in Latin, Lull had to invent a new word. It was homificare, literally to humanify. The human, Lull declared, is a humanifying animal. Homo est animal homificans. Humans, he said, humanify themselves, one another, the animal and vegetable kingdoms, and indeed the entire universe. But this is not the same as humanizing. It's not about imprinting the designs of preformed humanity on the raw material of an initially formless world. Rather, for humans to humanify themselves is to forge their existence within the crucible of a common life. Their humanness is not given from the start as an a priori condition, but emerges as a productive achievement, and one, moreover, that they have to continually to work at for as long as life goes on, without ever reaching a final conclusion. So if we follow Lull, then humans are not really beings at all, but becomings, launched in a process of perpetual co-creation. They are ever unfinished, even as history carries on. And for what they are at any moment in this history, they bear a collective responsibility. Children, for example, are not half-baked hybrids of biology and culture, but beings who make their way in the world with as much facility and hindrance, as much fluency and awkwardness as grown-ups. They are in the process not of becoming human, but of becoming the people they are. Or in a word, they are growing in stature, knowledge, and wisdom. But the child's life does not start from a point of origin, nor is his or her early life closer to such a point than later life. Rather than being literally descended from ancestors and destined to write out in life hereditary endowments passed on from parental generation at the point of conception, children follow in the ways of their predecessors. That's to say that lives overlap longitudinally, rather than being replayed in succession, with each generation carrying on from where the last leaves off. So their exchange is more like a handover in a relay than the transmission of a legacy. Moreover, what goes for the passage of generations goes for history in general. It too carries on or persists without beginning or end. People may follow where others have passed before, but none are more ancient, nor others more recent. It's not as though prehistoric hunter-gatherers were gifted with a roadmap for the future which their historic descendants were fated to follow. They've had rather to work things out, improvising a passage as they go along. It is indeed a constitutive quality of life, human as well as non-human, that it does not so much unfold from a point of origin as originate all the time. Life is continuous birth, as one distinguished elder from among the Weminshi Cree, indigenous hunters of northern Canada, explained to the ethnographer Colin Scott. And this is to imagine the evolution of life as the continual bringing forth of a world in which living beings, as they go along together, participate from within in creating the conditions for their own and others' future development. And history? Well, this is but a local manifestation of the same process. Working our way upstream, evolution runs into history as a river into the tributary that feeds it without crossing any barrier or threshold. So what room then remains for prehistory? Let me return for a moment to the ill-fated Neanderthals, whom I mentioned in passing a moment ago. Recall that according to the standard, or what we might call the standard narrative, humans of the anatomically modern variety, that is Homo sapiens sapiens, they alone made it through to the far side of nature, leaving their cousins, technically Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, stranded and destined for extinction. Now, this story is disturbingly familiar. It tells of how a race of men, possessed of superior intelligence, inherited the earth while subjugating, driving out, or exterminating its alleged inferiors. In the 19th century, it was white settlers who were supposed to have wiped out the indigenous inhabitants of the island of Tasmania, at that time considered the most primitive of humans. Yet a century after the Tasmanians were finally declared extinct, a vibrant Tasmanian Aboriginal community has emerged, all of whose members number Aboriginal people among their forebears. We are here, they say, and very much alive. The story of their extinction turns out to be a racist myth. So was it any different in the Paleolithic? Though far, far fewer in number, all the evidence suggests that humans were as mixed up then as they are now. No more are humans all of one subspecies or race today than they were of distinct subspecies in the prehistoric past. Neanderthals are us. So in short, mixed upness is the way we living creatures are. Carrying on our lives together and rubbing shoulders with one another, we continually enfold into our respective constitutions the qualities of others with whom or with which we relate. So in a world of life, there can be no pure kinds. Such a world of boundless difference rather than bounded diversity refuses to abide by the divisions and subdivisions of any taxonomy. It is an ever-emerging multiplicity, comparable perhaps to a plaited braid. In the braid, individual strands not only overlap, but wrap around one another as they go along. So coeval lives are braided in this sense. Of course, no creature lives forever, just as in the braid, every constituent strand is of a finite length. And yet the braid itself continues without limit. So life carries on indefinitely. With the multi-stranded braid, as with the life of many lives, the reasons are the same. Lives, like fibers, are bundled longitudinally. In the bundle, strands overlap along their length. Even as old strands begin to give out, new strands are introduced. So the old and the young, as they twist around one another, establish in the tension and the friction of their contact a grip even stronger than the combined tensile strength of the strands themselves. This analogy between the plaiting of the braid and the entwining of generations is not loose, but exact. Each and every strand is equivalent to the story of a life, of its doings and undergoings. It is, in this sense, its own record. However tightly it is bound with others, it retains its own individuality. And in the passage of time, this binding is of the essence. It's no wonder that among peoples around the world, plaited or knotted cords were not only among the most frequent repositories of ancestral lore, they were also commonly employed as measures of time. As cords were paid out, time would elapse and stories would be told. But this is no longer true today. Even as the twisting and spinning of fibers, once a ubiquitous task of daily life, has largely become confined as a niche art for hobbyists and the purveyors of heritage, and even as cord disappears from common use, so lives have ceased to be their own records, that is, stories to tell and to follow, and have instead become objects in the record, each played out not in ceasing to be the generation before and becoming the generation after, but in simply being itself. So as a prisoner of the present, every generation can receive nothing from the past save that which can be encapsulated in some transmissible form independently of its lifetime achievement. That's why modern theorists of evolution are so obsessed with the concept of inheritance, be it genetic or cultural. For them, without genetic inheritance, there could be no evolution, and without cultural inheritance, there could be no history. However, neither evolution nor history in the modern paradigm can be a life process, because where evolution and history cut across generations, life is confined within them. Inheritance is diachronic, but life is lived on the plane of synchrony. It's like running on one spot. So generations here are imagined not as plaited like strands, but as layered like sheets in a stack, such that the work of each is flattened in its own time. And here lies the source of the stratified conception of prehistory to which I referred at the outset. It's like a deposit, the spent residue of a history that has already moved onwards and upwards. This residue settles in layers, with the oldest furthest down, and there it stays, sinking ever deeper as time moves on. So as a deposit, the prehistoric past contains no potential for renewal. It's over. Renewal can come only from superimposition by adding further layers to the stack. Life, however, is not renewed through the addition of layers, but rather by its opposite, namely the act of burial. And this might be the point to recall Vico's speculation with which I began, that humans are distinguished above all by their affinity to the soil, revealed in the habit of burying their dead. Indeed, many humans do so, and these burials have yielded rich pickings for prehistorians and archaeologists. But the burial of the past is quite different from its deposition, for it's part of a cycle of life that carries on over generations. Like a seed or tuber that the farmer hopes will take root and grow, the human body in burial harbors in itself the forces of renewal that will bring forth future life. Excavation breaks the cycle by extracting the body from the ground rather than allowing it to regenerate. And that's why it has proved so contentious, above all in the campaigns waged by archaeologists in the wake of colonization to unearth the pasts of the peoples native to colonized lands. For these archaeologists, thinking of history as the positive impulse of progressive humanization, the grave is a kind of double negative, the already buried of a buried past. It's a locus of dehumanization, of the dissolution of humanity into nature, and accordingly they saw nothing wrong in emptying the graves they found of their bones and artifacts, and in transporting them to faraway museums for analysis and display. But for native people, the burial is an active force in a process of human growth and becoming, or of humanifying in Lul's sense. It's not just a place of death, but the guarantor of future life. So to unearth the burial is to render this guarantee null and void. Whether the damage can ever be repaired by repatriating the remains is moot. The cycle of life, once broken, is not easily made whole again. So let me return now to where we left prehistory, mired in a duplicitous concept of the human as both a species of nature and a condition of transcendence, caught between human being and being human. We've seen that this duplicity was an inevitable corollary of the Enlightenment program. Today we're witnessing the collapse of this program, along with the powers of European-led colonization that sustained it. So what then becomes of prehistory? Is there any space for prehistory in an era of post-humanism, or is it heading for oblivion? Can one be a post-human prehistorian? Well, if there was ever a candidate for this position, it would be the great French archaeologist and historian of technology, André Leroi-Gourhan. In his Gesture and Speech, first published in 1964 as Le Geste et la Parole, Leroi-Gourhan set out a comprehensive vision of human evolution running from our earliest ancestors, which he christened Archanthropians, through past and present Homo sapiens to the humans of the future. And the single tendency driving this evolution is what he calls exteriorization, by which he means the progressive offloading of bodily operations into an extrasomatic apparatus. That is, from bare hands to tools and machines in the domain of techniques, and from the mouth to writing in the domain of language. Working upwards, from hand to mouth and beyond, the final exteriorization will be of the brain itself into mechanisms of artificial intelligence equipped with emotional and moral sensibilities. And this was a development that Leroi-Gourhan anticipated already half a century ago with the advent of the electronic computer. Once machines have been designed that can outperform human bodies not only in creative thought but also in sexual love, Leroi-Gourhan opined, though we will have come to the end of the line as a zoological species, this will not be the end of humanity. For the machines in which human bodily and intellectual capacities are fully exteriorized will be us. Now, ostensibly, Leroi-Gourhan's oeuvre is an account of how an ascendant humanity broke through the bounds of purely zoological existence and of its expansion into the domains of social life and symbolic culture. And a key index of this transition was a growing facility in the manufacture and use of tools. The emergence of tools as a species characteristic, Leroi-Gourhan writes, marks the frontier between the animal and human, initiating a long transitional period during which sociology slowly took over from zoology. This was the period of prehistory. Well, inevitably, from this perspective, the denizens of the period figure as anomalous zoosociological hybrids, as neither one thing nor the other, but a bundle of contradictions. For example, while they appear capable of holding images in their minds of artifacts yet to be made, they seem unable to design the forms of artifacts for themselves, relying instead on received tradition. They have all the rudiments of symbolic intelligence and yet fail to activate them in intelligent operations. These contradictions, which can be multiplied indefinitely, leave us with one fundamental question unanswered. Is it possible, even in principle, let alone empirically, to identify what Leroi-Gourhan calls a radical turning point in our biological evolution as a zoological species, whence the history of technology literally took off from its foundations in innate capacities? Well, Leroi-Gourhan thinks we can, and repeatedly identifies it with an event in the evolution of the cranium, namely the enlargement of the cortex, and with it, the disappearance of the so-called prefrontal bar. That's the bony ridge above the eye sockets that in pre-human hominids divides the convexity of the skull from the facial block. So here's the face, here's the skull, and there's this ridge in between. Indeed, this prefrontal bar takes on a quite extraordinary and, in hindsight, preposterous significance in Leroi-Gourhan's account. More than a mere bump on the skull, it figures as a barrier whose removal opened the floodgates of symbolic imagination and launched humankind upon the tide of fully social and historic life. However, Leroi-Gourhan is nothing if not contradictory in himself, for no sooner has he pronounced upon our belonging to two worlds, respectively zoological and sociological, then he sets off down what he calls a third track, along which we would perceive that the lives of both humans and non-human animals are, as he says, neither instinctive nor intellectual, but to varying degrees zoological and sociological at one and the same time. And only by recognizing this, he suggests, will we be truly able to progress beyond the preoccupation with dividing the natural from the cultural that has dominated the last 2 centuries of scientific thought, to break down the disciplinary barrier between animal psychology and cultural anthropology, and really understand, as he says, what is animal and what is human. And it's above all in the second part of his book, Gesture and Speech, it's a part entitled Memory and Rhythms, that this third track argument appears. A great many operations, Leroi-Gourhan observes, entail the regular repetition of certain manual gestures. These include hammering, sawing, and scraping. Now, whether or not the artisan has an idea in mind of the final form of the artifact he is making, the actual form emerges from the pattern of rhythmic movement, not from the idea. So rhythms, in short, are the creators of forms. These are not rhythms of a mechanical kind, like the oscillations of a pendulum or a metronome, because they're set up through the continual sensory attunement of the practitioner's movements to the inherent rhythmicity of those components of the environment with which he or she is engaged. So making is necessarily a dialogue between maker and material, a sort of question and answer session in which every gesture aims to elicit a response from the material that will help lead the craftsperson towards his or her goal. But the final form, far from having been known all along and forced upon the material, is only fully revealed once the work is finished. Well, it follows that technical intelligence is to be found neither in the brain, nor in the hand, nor even in the tool it holds. An object that might be used as a tool is in and of itself no more than an inert lump of stone, wood, or metal of a certain shape. Likewise, anatomically speaking, the hand is merely an arrangement of skin, bone, and muscle tissue, and the brain merely an immense tangle of neurons. Intelligence belongs to none of these things taken singly. It rather inheres in the technical act, that is, the gesture, in which they are brought together. The human hand is human, Le Ragourant declares, because of what it makes, not of what it is. In other words, while the hand of the human may be an anatomical organ, the humanity of the hand is a compendium of capacities, each particular to one of the many tasks in which it is brought into use and the gestures it entails. Concentrated in skilled hands are capacities of movement and feeling that have been developed through life histories of past practice. Put a saw in my hand, and the hand knows how to saw. Put a knife and fork in my hands, and they know how to cut and pick up food. Put a pen in my hand, and it knows how to write. In the intelligent gesture, at once technically effective and perceptually attentive, hand and tool are not so much used as brought into use through their incorporation into a regular pattern of rhythmic, dexterous movement. And the intelligence of this use is not placed in advance of the technical act as a capacity of the individual mind in isolation, but arises as an emergent property of the entire form-creating system comprised by the gestural synergy of human being, tool, and material. Hands, in short, are organs not of humanizing, not of imprinting preconceived human designs on the raw material of nature, but of humanifying in the co-creation of emergent form. As humans are humaning, hands are handling, and in handling, they humanify the world. Well, at this point, I'd like to turn from the domain of technical operations to that of language, and particularly to its alleged exteriorization in writing. Because it's this above all that has conventionally been taken to mark the threshold in the transition from prehistory to history. Yet humans, as Le Ragourant acknowledged, were leaving relatively durable inscriptive traces of their movements and gestures long before the advent of writing proper. In making, the gestures of the hand holding a tool left their mark in the surfaces of the material. Speech, too, has always been accompanied and its force amplified by manual gesture, and these gestures, too, would sometimes leave a trace. And to refer to this inscriptive impulse in making and speaking, Le Ragourant coined the term graphism. Graphism was not drawing rather than writing, since, as Le Ragourant well knew, any such distinction would put the cart before the horse, introjecting into prehistory an opposition between the graph and the word, which could only arise a posteriori, after writing. Indeed, this circularity contaminates the very concept of prehistory, which only makes sense in the retrospective light of history. Or to put it bluntly, no one ever lived in prehistory. And if the very idea of history as a linear progression depends upon writing, then we cannot, without circularity, explain the origins of writing as part of a linear history. Rather, as Vico advised in his New Science, and I quote, "We must reckon as if there were no books in the world." We have, in short, to imagine a world of graphism, a world organized on principles very different from those with which we are familiar. The basic geometry of graphism, according to Le Ragourant, is radial. Like, he says, like the body of the sea urchin or the starfish. And in this it reflects the experience of a cosmos that stretches out towards the horizon, where sky and earth are perceived to meet, from a focus of dwelling within. Writing, by contrast, is fundamentally linear, each letter following the next, as do the sounds of speech to which they correspond. And where writing dominates the linguistic awareness of a society, where writing dominates the linguistic awareness of a society, this linearity inevitably imposes itself upon other aspects of experience. Thus, with writing, above all in its alphabetic form, the rounded cosmos of human dwelling was pierced, as Leroi-Gourhan vividly puts it, by an intellectual process which letters have strung out in a needle-sharp but also needle-thin line. Now subordinated to the demands of communicative efficiency, he explains, written language spearheaded the transition from cosmology to technology. And it was left to art, closely allied to religion, to compensate for the constriction of thought and imagery induced by the rationalization of language, to express the rhythmic qualities of experience rendered inexpressible within its formal conventions, and to restore human beings to their true place at the center of a multidimensional life world. Now, it's common today in the writings of both scholars and practitioners to oppose verbalization and embodiment, as though words had been fully co-opted by a disembodied intellect, and as if the authentic experience of the living body were rendered wordless. And such indeed would be the logical culmination of the exteriorization of language in writing that Leroi-Gourhan spells out for us. But I am not so sure. After all, words are spoken with feeling. They rise up on the breath and in the movements of our mouth and lips. And even when they're written, especially by hand, there's feeling in the manual gesture and the dynamic inflections of the resulting letter line. Words are indeed human things. They are the ways we have of making our presence felt, whilst also bringing into presence the persons, places, and matters whereof we speak. Other creatures do it differently, but verbal intercourse has always been our human way and our entitlement. So to celebrate the word, spoken or written, is not to have recourse to a doctrine of human exceptionalism. It's not to set ourselves up on a plane of transcendence. On the contrary, it is to find in the practices of speech and writing the same rhythmic qualities that Leroi-Gourhan found in making and graphism. They are, in this sense, ways of humaning. Another way, rather peculiar to our human selves, is upright bipedal walking. In walking, we continually place ourselves at risk by falling forwards, tumbling ahead of ourselves into the void, only to regain our footing in a skilled adjustment of body posture to the irregularities of the ground. So could it be that all human life is suspended in this alternation between an imagination that sets us loose to fall, and a perception that restores our grip so we can keep on going? The one opens up to what is yet to come, or in the words of the 20th century Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, the human is a not yet being, or in short, an aspiration. But the other establishes a foothold in the world from which we can once again venture into a future unknown. So where the first is aspirational, the second is prehensile. Perhaps then, humaning lies in the ever-present tension or temporal stretch between aspiration and prehension. Of course, if humans are humaning, Well, so baboons are babooning, birds are birding, and worms are worming. These creatures, too, are what they do and are recognizable by their particular forms of life. But there's still something about humaning that makes it of a different order. It is not that humans are unique in their recruitment of objects and artifacts as stabilizing elements in the conduct of social life. This is the view, for example, of the philosopher Bruno Latour. A sociology of intraspecific relations, Latour argues, may be fine for baboons, which in their babooning have only to deal with each other's bodies. But it won't work for humans who conduct their affairs by way of a miscellany of objects. Now, in deep prehistory, these objects included the tools of hunting. And it is telling that in describing the archetypal encounter between the prehistoric hunter and his prey, Latour characterizes the human-non-human relation as occurring not between the hunter and the animal, but between the hunter and his weapon. So in the Latourian scenario, while humans have been engaging in collectives with non-humans for millions of years, that is, ever since our ancestors started to make tools, striking stone on stone, it was the stones that were enrolled into the collective, not the animals hunted with them. The prehistory of the collective begins in the mediations of technology, not in the engagement with other life forms. And ever since this founding moment, according to Latour, the volume and scope of these object-oriented mediations have expanded exponentially in a progression from the hunting and gathering of our earliest ancestors through agriculture to the industrial society of today. It is curious, to say the least, that the stage on which Latour should take up arms to fight modernism, as he puts it, should be none other than one of modernism's most potent myths of origin. The reality, however, is that humans are by no means unique in calling on stable features of the landscape to anchor their relations, while among the plethora of objects that humans do enroll in daily life, especially in a society such as our own dedicated to mass consumption, the majority don't stabilize social relations at all. So my argument, contra Latour, is that it is not the enrollment of objects, but the stretch of human life that marks it out. For no other creature, surely, does imagination so run ahead of experience. Well, does this make humans any more or less exceptional in the animal kingdom? Well, of course they're different. All creatures are different. But are there differences such as to fundamentally alter the nature and meaning of life? Well, whatever we might say of humans in themselves, there's no denying that their activities have been of momentous consequence. Their numbers weigh ever more heavily on the planet. Even more so do the crops and livestock on which the vast majority feed. And especially over the past century or two of growth in industrial capacity and military might, humans have left an indelible imprint. And this has led some to declare the onset of a new epoch in the geological history of the Earth, namely the Anthropocene. It's a contested term, not least because of its connotations of anthropocentrism. We cannot, in truth, hold anthropocentrism to blame for the ecological devastation of the planet. For on the contrary, putting our human selves at the center amounts to a recognition that for every one of us, the world of experience radiates from where we stand to embrace others of every possible complexion, and to an acknowledgement of the debt we owe to these others for our existence as human beings. Decentering humanity would write off this debt. Indeed, the anthropocentric cosmos is precisely equivalent to what Le Roi Gourand attributed to the graphism of prehistoric times, and it is the very opposite of the techno-scientific cosmos of today. A humanity that had fully colonized its world and encompassed its lands and waters would not be at the center, but all around on the outside. This is not anthropocentrism, but what we might call anthropo-circumferentialism. But what will be the fate of humans in an anthropo-circumferential epoch? Are they on their way out? Perhaps, as post-humanists claim, the concept of humanity has run its course, brought down by the weight of its internal duplicity and by mounting inequalities between those who lay claim to universal humanity as of right and those, above all, the world's so-called indigenous peoples, for whom the forcible imposition of these claims has meant loss of land, livelihood, and sometimes even life. In the history of colonialism, the flag of humanity has always been flown by the victorious, treating as less than human those who have come under its yoke. And in a post-colonial world, claims to humanity have crumbled along with the powers that once sustained them. Post-humanity here signals a return to the soil, to the humus, and a renegotiation of our relations with the earth on a foundation of neither conquest nor exclusive possession, but of custodianship and care. So the post-colonial world, in this sense, is necessarily not only post-human, but also more than human. But to acknowledge this fact hardly amounts to a revolution in philosophy. For those who draw a living from the land or the oceans, it's a simple statement of common sense. That the earth abounds with vitality of every possible kind, and moreover that these other than human kinds have ever entered into relations with one another and even held meanings for one another, regardless of the presence or even existence of humans, has long been obvious to everyone, barring a handful of influential Western philosophers. So let's not confuse post-humanism with anti-humanism. Rather, we should see in post-humanism the possibility of taking a step beyond the opposition between humanism and anti-humanism. And this is to make a move in a different direction entirely, orthogonal to the opposition. So I'm with Lull in reimagining a humanism in which to human is a verb, or to repeat, homo est animal homificans. Thank you.